From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to a very special episode of the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. It's our 100th episode. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help us celebrate our 100th episode, we've invited 6 of our past guests to join us and share what has changed since their last appearance. But before we bring on our amazing guests, allow me to introduce my co-hosts, Joelle Mitchell and Alicia Pappas. How are you today, Joelle?
I saw on my drive into work, I was stopped at the traffic lights, and on the curb beside me was a midsection of a snake.
Just a midsection.
Just a midsection, and it had been cleanly sliced on each end. So it hadn't, there was no evidence of gnawing. So it's a puzzle.
How did you know it was a snake if it was missing the head and the tail?
Well, because I've seen snakes and I know what their skin looks like.
How fast were you driving?
I was stopped at the lights.
Okay.
So I had a plenty of time to peer out of my window and observe.
It wasn't a scarf?
No, there was clearly a spine and then a meat section. Yeah.
Joelle, have you been taking any substances recently?
I have not.
Just checking. Okay.
I was stone cold sober.
That's unlike you.
What can I say?
Listeners, that's not true. A mystery.
Yeah.
Interesting. Maybe there was a cart that had snakes on there for people to cook, and one fell off the back.
Who knows?
Yeah, look, let's not probably dwell on that too long.
I'd rather if we didn't.
I'd like an update on a future episode, but this is going to be a long episode.
Yes.
So we should probably bring in Alicia. How are you today, Alicia?
Hi, both. I'm doing okay. I'm coming off a bit of a migraine, so if I am not too articulate or a bit vacant with some of my responses, that's why. But I'm getting ready to move house next week, so it's just all happening. I'm having I don't know if I'm going left or right at the moment.
Well, luckily we're recording this over many days. So hopefully you're a bit sharper on some of the other days that we're recording. We won't be asking you to do too much of the heavy lifting on this episode, Alicia.
Thanks, Jason.
But glad to have you in as one of our special co-hosts.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. So we've got 6 guests, so we should probably introduce the first one in.
Yes, let's get to that. So Dr. Rebecca Michalak appeared in episode 6, which was called A Reality Check on Sexual Harassment, which was released on February 12th back in 2021. So Beck, welcome again.
Thank you so much for having me back, and congratulations.
Yeah, 100 episodes. Who would have guessed?
Me.
I would have actually, because it's a really good quality podcast. So
you're only what?
Expecting
episode
200.
6.
Episode 6, yeah.
Yeah,
so,
it was touch and go back then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Joelle's still deciding whether she was going to be on the podcast or be a people diagnostics employee at the time.
This is true. It was
there we go.
Oof.
Yeah, over a year of employment and 100 podcast episodes in, and she's still here.
I'm still just teetering on the edge.
Yeah, just don't make her an offer, anyone, because I want to hear.
As long as you've got your EAP in place, isn't that all you need, really?
Funny enough, we don't have an EAP.
No, we've got a bar.
It's cheaper and more fun.
It is. In all seriousness, though, this is a serious topic. So Beck, lots has happened. Your episode aired, and then almost immediately afterwards, the Brittany Higgins story sort of came to air in the media, and there's been a lot going on in Australia since then. Can you take us through some of those key events and how they've helped sort of shape the narrative of sexual harassment in Australia?
Look, I think there's probably a couple of key points that I make there, and I think one that businesses really need to, if they haven't already cottoned on to, is, and they need to get across, is that these incidences now, yes, they're safety issues, but they are business risks because they hit the media. Brittany Higgins is one example. There have been others that have gone through, in the last 3 to 5 years, for example, where, once it gets into the media, it really does take on a life of its own. So, I think Brittany Higgins was probably, in terms of the political environment, it was particularly poignant. And I certainly think that it had, some influence over what we have seen in recent weeks with the change of government. So, but I think too that, over this time, there's been some other things that have been brewing for quite some time in the background that have finally all sort of come together, a bit like the very slow moving sort of tsunami has sort of hit the shore. So we had already had the Boland Review and, the recommendation that we should have increased regulations around this stuff. So, it's kind of not surprising that all of these things have now started to manifest, looking at sort of, that 24-month mark beyond that. And we're starting to see the codes of practice come out. We're starting to see sexual harassment really explicitly addressed in its own category, and then in tangential categories too, because we're seeing things around gendered violence. We're looking at family and domestic violence. We've got, other forms of aggression that are often linked to sexual harassment and assault type aggression in the workplace. So I think that the regulation is sort of coming together as well. And I think that, organisations now should be eyes wide open to this as a safety issue. My observation is that that's not necessarily the case. I'm still seeing a lot of variation between organisations, still a lot of dogmatic HR lensed stuff going on. And I guess if I was going to issue forewarning to any of the listeners of the podcast, is to say, if you're looking another 12 or 24 months down the track and your PCBU is still not got sexual harassment under that safety banner and that risk management perspective, you're probably going to find yourself in a fair bit of trouble, would be my forewarning.
Good forewarning. Good. Hopefully everybody's listening to that. From the business community, what have you seen in the way that they've responded to these events? We've had, the Respect at Work report come out. In WA, we've had, sort of the parliamentary inquiry into sexual harassment. We've had the report from Rio Tinto. So we've had a lot of these sort of quite significant surfacings, I guess, of what, a lot of us have known about for a very long time, but it's now been made really very public and harder to deny or sweep under the rug, I guess. So what's sort of the response that you've seen when these types of reports and things have come to light?
Look, I think if we wanted to specifically mention what's been going on in the mining sector, and of course the inquiry that was just undertaken, it was pretty public. And again, it was in the news cycle, a reasonable amount. I think it's really easy to get caught in kind of a race to the bottom and say, mining's got huge problems with these behaviours. Mining is not alone. It's basically everywhere. So, okay, then we're not as bad as mining, or other organisations have got bigger problems than us. Again, you need to go and lift that bit of, go into the corner of your business and go and have a really good hard look in places you don't want to go and have a look. So I think there's a kind of a comparison. Easy to go after these sort of publicly named organisations and sectors and focus on them. I would say to people, be very forewarned again that it's everywhere. And unless you are really, really proactively assessing this risk and going out and proactively trying to identify lead indicators of these sorts of behaviours going on in your organisation. So unless you're really on the front foot of kind of an ISO 45003 approach, the chances are you're not across it to the level that you should be in your business. Now, Respect at Work was interesting because, again, it kind of landed right when the pandemic hit, and that was very unfortunate in terms of timing. But even now that we've seen the response, there's probably more that could have been done with that. Having said that, again, the safety that brought, the safety perspective to the forefront. And, I spoke, I think, in the first episode about how we have these multiple jurisdictions that it can fall under. And there's that temptation to just kind of buck pass it off to another jurisdiction. Every organisation needs to have this under their safety banner, and they need to have a risk management perspective on it. I think my observation, I sort of alluded to it before, is there's a wide degree of variation. So I have some clients, for example, that are in the mining sector, and some of them, started work on this topic actually quite some time ago. It's probably gained speed, so to speak, with recent developments. But, I also am aware of other sectors and other organisations that are still very much just in that almost pathological maturity phase, where it's just blissful ignorance or outright denial. I think most organisations, most organisations are probably sitting in that, not quite compliant space. They're aware there's an issue. They're probably aware that they need to do more about it, and they're just not that clear on what it is exactly that they need to do. So I think, if you've started that journey where it's on your radar and you're starting to think about it as a safety hazard, and you're starting to, integrate it into that perspective, that's a good position to be in. You need to move fast, though. As I said, if you are 12 months or 24 months from now and you still have this sitting under a sort of HR umbrella, you're still engaged in those very typified non-trauma informed practices around that, then that's going to get you in trouble in the health and safety regulation front.
Yeah. And then looking ahead, sort of thinking, in the next 12 to 24 months, what do you expect to happen in this sort of sexual harassment space during that period of time?
Look, I think COVID has really sort of produced the bingo card that many of us didn't think we'd be playing the last few years, and it's still a little unpredictable as to exactly how that will divert our attention, so to speak. That aside, I think that we're going to see continuing attention with it. I think that the regulation side of things is really ramping up, and it's coming through thick and fast. Now we're seeing other developments occurring. So the banning of insurance, for example, is starting to filter through as well, which was another one of the Boland recommendations. So, and I think as it becomes front and centre, and then we're seeing the safety profession is really, taking it and kind of putting it under their wing, and they're starting to push forward with agendas in that respect. So I think it's going to ramp, and whether it ramps extraordinarily quickly or just at a very steady pace, I think that's a little bit contingent on some other external, kind of drivers. But I do think that any organisation that thinks that they can just park this issue and look at it again in a couple of years, that would be a really, really poor approach in my view.
Yeah. Okay. So sounds like what we will be seeing, hopefully, for safety teams in larger organisations is actually probably much more diverse safety teams in terms of backgrounds and experience and sort of skill sets to actually be able to be across the different hazards and sort of clusters of hazards, I guess, that will be coming through with the new regs. So that's an interesting space to watch as well.
And to see how we go with this whole working with HR kind of enigma. So there's been some conversations around that. And to reiterate what I hope I've made clear in other discussions around this, I think that the ideal scenario is a collaboration between HR and safety when it comes to psych health and safety. I think that that's the ideal environment. Both professions bring some unique skills and expertise to the table. And I think to solve relatively complex problems, it takes that sort of not even just a bidisciplinary approach. I think we actually really need transdisciplinary. We need people who are across, psychology, HR, work design things, risk, legalities, the IR frameworks, business risk, and bringing it up a level all the way into ESG, and we need to be working on the problems ideally together and coming up with effective solutions. So that's another thing I would say is, again, if you've still got that siloed approach where there's stuff sitting just under safety and there's stuff sitting just under HR, and you haven't really started those conversations, that's something you really need to get on and get cracking with in the next, say, 12 months. Because I think it's going to be very difficult to move agendas forward if we haven't got that, either the collaboration established, or if it's going to sit under a particular home, and ideally that should be safety, that the jurisdiction is awarded there and they're on with it. They've got their objectives and they've got their, pathway to carve. So I think clarity around that really needs to be achieved probably in the next 6 months or so. By the end of the year, you need to be clear. Sexual harassment, bullying, psych health and safety stuff. Have we got enough of a safety and risk management perspective on it? If we haven't, why not? And if we haven't got HR and safety working together as a minimum, again, why not? And somebody needs to take control of it. And if that has to be safety, then safety can step up. And they are building, capability in this space pretty quickly. So, again, I think that journey will continue across the safety profession in building that psych health and safety expertise. Safety now does look different to what it did maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I think psych health and safety is really going to be, it's here to stay, and it's going to be a pretty clear focus for quite some time.
Interesting thoughts, Rebecca, and thank you for sharing those with our listeners. I hope that they heed your words well and take steps accordingly. So thank you so much for joining us on this special episode. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, Beck.
Thank you again for having me. And again, congratulations. Great work.
Thank you.
Cheers. Okay, so now we'd love to welcome Wade Needham in. Wade's a repeat guest, most recently appearing in a live panel event for episode number 54, Beyond ROI, How Psych Health and Safety Creates Social Impact. And that was released on September 9, 2021. So over 6 months ago. It feels like a lot, not that much time has passed.
Yeah. It's weird. Lots of time and no time.
Yeah.
At the same time.
But yeah, no, great to have you on, Wade.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, so this is counting, this is number 4, I think, the 4th time that you've been on, because we've done 2 live panels together, which one that you moderated very, very well, I might add. And then you were on the 2nd episode ever that we recorded. You're our first guest on the podcast.
To be back.
Yeah, no,
it's nice to continue to have something to share.
Yeah. So last time you were on, we were really covering this idea of social impact. So the S under ESG. And I guess for guests and listeners who I guess want to learn more about ESG and this, how safety kind of fits underneath that, for a broader explanation of that topic, that episode number 54 would be a good one to go back to. But what I'd really like to talk about, Wade, is, there's obviously a continually growing interest in ESG as boards are meeting investor desire that they operate sustainable and ethical companies. So while there is a large focus, I think everyone can see that, on environmental sustainability and even governance. Have you seen any more movement since we last caught up regarding the S in the ESG?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And I think one of the most pleasing things is that we have seen some increases in the reporting in the social side of things. It hasn't just been all either environmental traffic, and I think that sort of reflects this greater understanding of materiality. And really, for those that are listening, materiality is really something that reflects both the organisation's significant economic, environmental and social impacts, but also what substantively influence the assessments of decisions of stakeholders. So we're seeing more and more of that. And Rebecca spoke about how sexual harassment is affecting share price and capital markets. And so investors are becoming more sophisticated through leveraging tools such as ESG indices, and that's better informing how people are allocating capital. So I think that's a real big positive that we are seeing, but we're also seeing people become more sophisticated, and we're seeing some organisations shift. For example, when reporting under GRI 403 standard on health and safety, we're seeing more people get outside of the standard TRIFA reporting and starting to include more reporting in the areas of 403-3 in the Occ Health Services, but even more pleasing, actually seeing some content that used to be in the occupational health services now making its way, courtesy of 45,003 and some new legislation around risk management in psychosocial risk, into actually the disclosure 403-2, which is about hazard identification, risk assessment and incident investigation. So it's really good to see, and I think we'll see more of it as this becomes more of interest to consumers. And they not only want to see provenance stories in the environmental space, but also they want to see more past and not just around modern slavery. They want to see living wage. They want to see how people, how are their consumables or products that they're buying? How are the people? What is the story behind it? Not just the environmental impacts and the environments they're made in.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, even as recently as this week, I saw that the ILO have voted to include health and safety as a fundamental human working right. So right up there with, like you say, the abolition of child labour and whatnot. So,
and that's got major impacts because that then becomes part of free trade agreements, and that brings it upon discussions, but also that brings it into light around when different trade blocs are negotiating and there's different disparagement of standards. And so that is one great fear of mine, is sustainability will be used as the new trade bloc barrier to prevent certain economies and regions from not being able to trade in areas because they may have a less mature process or less sophisticated process to manage risk. But also those regions certainly do need income. And that's what we saw in relation to the Atlassian decision to pull out of Ukraine and the challenges, even when you have government regulations and those types of things. It's difficult for companies to navigate because there's multiple byproducts. You have to both meet the government of the day's needs, but also secondly, you have to meet employees' needs. So the diverse management of how people thread the needle and stakeholders is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned before around reporting and using the GRI 3 and 2, like you mentioned. So what role does this kind of measurement play in maybe elevating psychological health and safety specifically up to board and even shareholder level, as well as, health and safety more generally?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and one of the things that listed entities now have to grapple with is there's multiple ESG indices that measure and give scores to investors and fund managers that they have to provide reporting to. So this culmination of sort of the aggregation of data and standards that people are measured to is positive, and I think the more people are using, for example, either the GRI or the SASB, the greater levels of transparency and reporting against those standards, the higher levels of scores organisations are able to achieve. And I think the big thing for me is that often organisations are choosing which of the disclosures to actually disclose against, and it's still acceptable to not disclose against all of them. And also not be audited to all of them as well. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. So the more and more I want to see is things like reporting against, the 403 disclosure 10, which is work-related ill health. So we need to start that process, and often that is solely around exposure to occupational hygiene type dust, chemicals. Those types of reports find their way in, but not so much psychosocial risks that eventuate in psychological harm. So I think that's the first area will come through, and positive to see the reporting requirements coming into the Victorian or proposed in relation to that area. So that hits both at a social impact perspective, but also under a governance perspective as legislation and expectations of the regulators change. So more and more over time, I see greater reporting. That affecting investors' decisions, but secondly, also that will also affect consumers' decisions as well.
Yeah, well, I think the future is really interesting in this space, Wade, as we've spoken about a number of times before off air. Obviously, there's different reasons why a company might be interested in psych health and safety, from purely the moral reason, to the legal and, like we're saying, the incoming regulations in Australia specifically, meeting their legal obligations, and then also looking at ROI. But we know that ROI information that we've got hasn't really moved the needle in terms of companies becoming more psychologically healthy. The legislation one, we're hoping a bit more of this carrot, as we'll talk about with our next guest, might actually move the needle a little bit. But then, I think this one, the sustainability one, is something that is really gathering steam in a really positive direction for how companies are governed.
Yeah, and I think we are seeing people will pay a premium for what we call high claims type, either goods or services, where there is that transparency through the value chain or supply chain, right from either in food, from paddock to plate, or it might be from where raw materials are sourced right through the production. So we know scope 3 is the biggest issue that is in discussion with a lot of boards at the moment. Wouldn't it be great to understand, and we could take the concept of shared duties of care, which are enshrined in legislation, and really it's not that far of a hop jump to sort of scope 1, 2 and 3, right? It's a very similar concept, and we do know that within the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, this will become a growing area of emergence as we assuming and hopeful that we start making these key changes on the environmental side, because that's the beautiful thing about health, is that if you don't have a balance of environmental health, people health and animal health, you actually don't have health at a global scale. Depending on which way you subscribe to, the pandemic was a very good example of how something can jump from the animal health side to affect the human health area. So that's a concept I think will grow more and more, that integrative type thinking.
Well, Wade, as always, you've kind of opened up our eyes to some, even broader issues than what we got you on to discuss. I think you're very good at doing that. So, look, thank you so much for not only coming on today and sharing some, future kind of insights about what to look for, I guess, around the ESG and sustainability angles, but also for all the previous times that you've been on the podcast. You'd say that you're actually the first friend of the podcast, given that you're our first guest, and you're a very good friend of the podcast. So thanks, Wade, so much for, what you've been able to share with our listeners over the journey of our 100 episodes.
Very happy, and congratulations on the 100, and here's to the next 100.
Thanks, mate. Take care.
Thanks, Wade.
So we have Peter Kelly with us today on our 100th episode as well. So Peter is another repeat guest. So he's featured initially in episode 3, Management Standards, Past, Present and Future, which was released on the 5th of February 2021. How are you going today, Pete?
G'day, Alicia. How are you?
Not too bad, as per usual.
Have you recovered from paying my bill at that dinner date we had in Melbourne a few months ago?
Did I pay your bill? I think you paid my bill.
No, I think Jason paid the bill for both of us.
Maybe it was one each.
Right.
Yes. That was, when was that? February. Time flies.
It was. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm. So we'll jump in to all things psych health and safety. So Pete works at the Health and Safety Executive. So that's Britain's national regulator for health and safety in the workplace. So Pete, how is the executive positioning itself to regulate psych health and safety in the UK?
Oh, geez, that's a great question, isn't it? The same as we were doing 23 years ago, but with a lot more vigor, I think would be a good description. We've just launched our next 10-year strategy, and we've put health as a top priority, specifically the management of work-related stress and depression and anxiety in workplaces. So that kind of gives you a foundation stone on which we can sort of move out and start doing the work we should have been doing 20 years ago, which is a degree of regulatory activity. I don't know about you, Alicia, but I think in this area, for a long time, there's been an enormous carrot, probably like a bunch of carrots. And at times, people have just sort of taken it for granted that regulators won't interact or intervene in this area. Well, we definitely have to intervene now. You know what I mean?
So what does, when you mentioned intervening, what does that look like? What's the future for the regulatory environment in the UK?
And I think the regulatory environment will be twofold. One will be encouraging people to manage psychological health and safety and to address stress. And two, we will use the regulatory powers that we have. If the cases come along where we feel there's a general sense that we could intervene. We did issue a notice recently. We will issue notices if the circumstances are right. As you may or may not be aware, our regulations require that under the Health and Safety at Workers Act that you actually manage all risks of health and safety. I didn't say put in the act excluding psychological issues. And then there is a requirement under the management regs to do a risk assessment. So that's the first bit of legislation. And there's a requirement in Reg 5 to do something about the identified risks. So we would expect people to do the requirements of the Act. I've trained most of the inspectors in the last 8 years on how to take a case. I'm confident that if the right cases come in, then we will do as we've done recently and issue a notice. And this is not just the UK going alone on this. I know in Australia they're keen to issue notices, and the Victorian legislation will facilitate some of that work. Queensland, Western Australia, everyone's jumping in. Canada have been looking at it, and also conversations in the States. So I'd like to, it's almost paralleling what it was like with asbestosis. There was a necessity. We had to intervene because asbestosis was was effectively creating masses of ill health, and people were dying from it. For us, at 17.8 million days lost to work-related stress and 828,000 people off. As a regulator, you have to intervene. It's the primary occupational health condition, and it accounts for 57% of all sickness absence.
So you have already issued notices. You go in and intervene, and then you say, this is what needs to happen, so you can meet the standards. Do you think that organisations in the UK are clear on what they need to do practically in order to prevent harm?
They're becoming clearer. I think it's an amazing what actually a notice does in terms of waking alertness in the sector that you issue the notice in. Suddenly everyone becomes acutely aware of what is the requirement. We are running a campaign at the moment, which is for the next two years called it's Working Minds, and it's exclusively about the 5 R's: respond, react, record, and make it routine to have conversations. So that's the soft touch. And the 5 R's are the 5 steps of risk assessment. We've just reworded them to make it easier for people to understand from a brand. That's what I think. That's what all different regulators have to do is to be aware of how they brand their information, make it understandable to people that are in the workforce, and not some sort of scientific loving, if you know what I mean. So
yeah. I mean, the legislation can be quite dry and vague. So that's kind of what's happened in Australia. So especially in Victoria, as you mentioned, there's changes coming to the legislation because it's been quite, health and safety. Employers have an obligation to keep their work environments healthy and safe. So historically, that's been more focused in terms of what organizations have been doing, focused on physical health and not so much on psychological health. But the regulator in Victoria, WorkSafe, they've basically put in regulations that are coming to stipulate, what that actually looks like, what employers should be doing to prevent psychological harm. Because if you just are aware of the Work Health Safety Act and OH&S guidelines, they're not specific enough. So like you're saying, that's a big education piece around and using the language that people will understand.
as you know, when I was back in February, I met with them and we had that exact conversation. Obviously, over the course of the last 20 years, in terms of regulatory activity, I've been involved in most of the cases that we've taken. So the basic principles from 20 years ago are exactly the same now.
Yeah.
And we have to realize that actually it isn't just a nice to, like to, it's an absolute fundamental of health and safety, is that you manage the level of demands and the control and support and role, relationship and change elements, which are part of our management standard. If you manage them, you're in a much better place. And I was resistant to 45,003, if I'm honest, at the start, because I thought it's way too technical. 95 pages was the first standard, and it didn't really hit the box. As you know, I got involved through the committee structure, and I think in 45,003, if I'm going to go into an organization, a large organization, and they've identified stress, then 45,003 would actually facilitate Reg 5 for me, because it's a system for managing the identified risk. So if you had 45,003, I'm more confident that you're perhaps addressing it, because the central question has always been, what does an intervention look like? Well, interventions are determined by the characteristics of the company, the size, amongst other things. And actually, until we do more activity in this area, we're probably we'll be for the next few years looking at interventions and making assessments. I do think we could be 5 years off where we know what interventions potentially work, because we'll have gone through activities that have forced people to do that.
Yeah. So in terms of how things are changing here, it's going to become clearer, what actions organizations need to take to prevent harm and control the risks. So with what you're doing, you mentioned the campaign that's going ahead. Are there any psychological health and safety regulations in place at the moment that stipulate what organizations have to do?
Well, we use the outline from the 1974 Act, the Health and Safety Work Act, and the management regs. Those alone are the regulatory environment that we work in. But we have done significant work around stress and mental health to make people aware of what our expectations are, to give them as much information as we can. So things like talking toolkits, the new campaign. So what we're saying to people is, our expectation is that you as an employer, as with 45,001, as with the many systems that are out there for health and safety, you need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I'm just hearing there's a framework in place, or there's guidance and direction in terms of what organizations need to do, and you're working more on educating organizations on what this looks like, so that there's more awareness rather than they get a notice and they didn't know what they had to do from more of a proactive perspective.
I would probably say, listen, after the pandemic, if you're not aware of mental health, then you must have had your head in the sand, because actually the pandemic has changed the narrative of work. We're now scrabbling around for something we should have been on top of, which was hybrid working. Years ago, we should have been on top of it. But now we're like, well, what does hybrid working look like? What's that agreement? I think the time for a soft touch has been and gone. And I think you'll find an appetite amongst regulators globally. This is that we have to intervene. We are looking at global numbers across every major continent is having issues on work-related stress, mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, everyone is aware there is a need both to offer a large bunch of carrots, but the occasional stick.
Yeah. So, I guess the take-home message is, there are regulations across the globe, and there's more and more traction in implementing those regulations and having regulators actually give organizations notice if they're not meeting
and as
requirements.
regulators we do talk, and we have Teams meetings, and there is that cross-fertilization, because I think it's important to build up knowledge so that we know what a good case looks like, and that. So some will blame the recession and say, oh, well, I can't do things due to the recession. Recessions come every 10 years. A global pandemic happens about once every 100 years. But what we do know from the previous pandemic, and what we're seeing is we have a significant increase in mental health issues. So 25% increase in depression and anxiety globally, of which, if you look at the workforce between 16 and 65 or 67, if you're in the UK, a large proportion of that 25% increase will be in that environment. So therefore, do we just simply ignore it and put it in the too hard category, or do we actually be active in the area? I'm of the opinion we have to be active in the area. We can no longer ignore this, because it will be, and it is the new asbestos.
Yeah. It's shifting from not having awareness, being reactive, to being proactive and focusing on prevention. Yeah, definitely. Okay, thanks. We won't take up any more of your time because I know you have another conference to get to this morning. So thank you for popping in again, and we will speak to you again, I'm sure.
All right, so I'm very excited now to introduce our next guest, Hayley Farrell. She appeared in episode 53, Adopting the ISO 45003 Standard. And that episode was released on September 6, 2021. How are you, Hayley, and welcome again.
Thanks, Joelle. Good to be back. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
We're doing all right. Trucking along.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Busy as always.
Yes, lots on the go, but it's mostly good.
It's all good.
It's all good. It's all good.
Good.
So, Hayley, since you last appeared on the podcast and you were talking about the process of, implementing 45,003 and what that was like, since then you've gone through the process of actually becoming accredited through BSI, or the unofficial accreditation, or whatever it is that they call it. What did that process look like?
Yeah, I think BSI are quite specific about the wording. So yeah, it is an unaccredited standard, but we have been certified to the scheme. So that's what the process is at the moment. But yeah, it's been quite an interesting process, I guess, in terms of the standard landing on your desk, reading it, understanding it, going through the process of having an external gap analysis, trying to understand how you can plug any of those gaps, then going through a management system audit, and then actually going through the practical audit in terms of, does your occupational health and safety management system actually do what it says it does? So really interesting process. And I think if I reflect couple of months on, the consistent agile nature of the standard and the consistent learning, in terms of new challenges, new risks, new needs in terms of employee-based colleagues that arise, that you kind of have to keep adapting to. So it's been a really interesting journey, and one that we're still very much in the beginning phases of, as an organization, and I think as a collective as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point you raised there, that it's not just a sort of set and forget type of standard. It is something that you need to keep coming back to, and those processes are there to be that sort of cyclical process of continual improvement.
Absolutely. It's so important.
So what were the main reasons that MCOR had for becoming accredited?
So quite early on, we adopted 27500, which is around the human-centered organization, and it's about putting people at the heart of decision-making. And as an organization that doesn't have particular assets or things that we can sell, our people are our assets, and we go and we service our clients' buildings and facilities, etc. We also have quite a strong social value and sustainability agenda in terms of how do we ensure that we are giving back to the community, but in doing so, look after your own first, and that kind of naturally and organically will filter out into the community as well. So with both of those in mind, we decided to go for 45,003 to complement our 45,001 management system. And I think it was just really important for us to, again, verify that what we were doing in the well-being space was the right thing, but also to identify how we can improve. And I think for me, the conversation in terms of well-being has moved on somewhat. We were talking about apple baskets and yoga, which I talk about as kind of the promotional tertiary element of well-being. But then the well-being strategy kind of needs to expand in terms of intervention, which is secondary, but then this prevention piece, which is a primary intervention essentially. And this is for me where psych health and safety fits. So it's about expanding your well-being strategy. And I think that's where we really saw an opportunity to do something a bit more different and to start addressing workplace risks that are having a negative impact on employees so that we can mitigate that wherever possible, and not just promote good self-management of well-being without eliminating risks that are not enabling people to do those good things.
Yeah, okay. So it was very much aligned to, I guess, your sort of core business strategy and values, I guess, your corporate values in terms of putting people first.
Absolutely. We went through a rebranding as well in terms of our purpose, a better world at work, and our values. So it was all part of, I suppose, the evolution of mid-pandemic. How do we come out of this, and how do we make something that's sustainable and that's going to be sustainable change over time? And that was all part of our thinking.
Yeah. And so given that you're now sort of through that process of implementing an accreditation, and you're, one of the first companies in the world to have gone through that process, do you have hints or tips that you can, or that you'd like to share with listeners who are thinking about going through that process?
Absolutely. I think when you look at, and one of the previous guests actually spoke about it right in the beginning, it's a 94 to 97 page document, and there are some seismic words in there that can be quite overwhelming. And to understand how you integrate 45,003 into your existing well-being strategy, I think what's really important and to make clear is that it doesn't replace all the work that you're doing, because there seems to be some confusion that 45,003 is now the focus in terms of just taking a risk-based approach. As I've already mentioned, it's part of your well-being strategy. So when you're looking at that document and you're seeing the big words like psychological health and safety and psychosocial risk, it's important, and this is a tip that can be really helpful, is to use the language that you use within your organization to talk about mental health and well-being. The word psychosocial risk might put a lot of people off. Risk management might put a lot of people off because we're talking about well-being. So it's about language. It's also about, for me, when you are wanting to implement something like this and get leadership buy-in, understand what the leadership's pain points are and what language the leaders speak, such as, is it risk management? Is it sustainability? Is it social value? Is it corporate social responsibility? And use that as leverage to be able to build your business case as to why 45,003 is going to enable you to be progressive in the well-being space. And I also think, talking around leadership, the understanding that this isn't a once-off certification. You know, it can't be something that you get and you put on the shelf and say, right, I'm accredited to 45,003. There is going to be investment over time. The more we get into the space, the more risks and hazards that are identified, there might be a need for further investment. So it's about understanding that right from the get-go, I guess. Why are we doing this? Are we doing it to make authentic change, or are we doing it just because we want to align our management systems? But again, it's then just a management system. It's not we're doing what we say we do type thing.
Yeah. I think that's a good learning, even sort of more broadly around, understanding the mental models of the groups that you're talking to, and finding a way to explain these sort of new concepts or ideas in a way that fits into their existing mental models, and then it's a much easier sell, if you like. So that's a great tip, and certainly, yeah, it's not a set and forget type of an approach, as with a safety management system as well. If it's going to be effective, you need to keep working away at it consistently.
Absolutely. And I think just furthermore, safety and where does it sit? We're talking about occupational health and safety systems. And I think collaboration in terms of an organization adopting this is really, really important, and making sure that key stakeholders from HR to your ED&I lead to your supply chain partners are all on board with what we're trying to do, as well as potentially your business continuity manager and change and improvement managers, because all of these things impact your people. Supply chain will have a psychological health and safety impact, and therefore get them on board early and really make sure that the understanding of what we're trying to achieve is a collaborative approach. It's not something that's being done to. We're doing this together. I think is really important.
Yep. So collaboration is a strong theme coming through from our guests so far today.
Mm-hmm.
Hayley, thank you so much for joining us today on our special episode. It's been lovely to catch up with you again, and thank you for sharing those great tips with our listeners.
Thanks, Joelle. Take care. Thanks, Jason.
Okay, it's time to bring in our next guest. David Burroughs appeared in episode 83, When Everyone is an Expert. It was released on February 22 this year. And you know what? It's actually our third most listened to episode at the moment. The only one there's only two that's beating it. Alicia, you want to have a guess of what they are?
Is it still number one, Joelle's initial episode?
Yeah,
sure,
it is.
Yeah, just me and Joelle, number one. Yep. And then number two?
Number two, tough one. It wouldn't be, Tony hasn't come up the ranks, has he?
Tony's still number two.
Tony is still number two.
Yeah, but Dave's
nipping at his heels.
He's close. He's catching up at a rate of
closing
knots.
that gap.
It's only
Can I
probably...
just say they're worthy adversaries. I'm happy for you guys to be winning, and I'm more than happy for Tony to be sitting in front of me. That's absolutely fine.
But David, your episode has gone down a treat. Definitely resonated very well with our listener group, and throughout LinkedIn. You had some very choice clips that we were able to extract from the conversation with you. But I guess today I'd like to ask you a question around the misinformation that's out regarding the psych health and safety area. I guess as the market and the appetite for this type of work increases, the misinformation we can only anticipate will also probably increase. So in your opinion, what are the biggest mental health fictions organisations should be aware of?
I think that it's a great question, and yes, it is happening, and it's going to happen more. And I think some of the reasons why it is happening is that organisations haven't necessarily kept up with what all the research has been telling us for quite some period of time. And when we look at so many organisations have been focused on deficit-based models or injury-centrist models or medicalised models rather than psychosocial models, there's now a heck of a lot of catch-up. When you see a situation like that, then there's some huge appetite within corporates to sort of digest mental health related services. We often see sort of people rushing towards what are the solutions, what are the things that we can sell and whatnot in this space. So there's a fair bit of misinformation out there at the moment. I think there's a fair bit of sort of fear mongering around what's involved in psychosocial risk, for example, and whatnot, that I'm seeing sort of, pop up across the industries right now. So if I look at sort of what I think some of the biggest issues are, is still this notion that when we're looking at these things, it's around fixing people rather than fixing workplaces. That if we just have people with enough mental illness literacy, then we've done our job when it comes to a psychologically healthy and safe workplace. But I think a lot of these things are driven through just the lack of understanding from the people who are procuring these services around what's actually required to do this work well. I think there's a huge knowledge gap there at the moment. It's the first time in my career I've seen the sophistication of regulators significantly exceed the sophistication within a lot of organisations, with codes of practice around psychosocial hazards and ISOs and those sorts of things. I think there's a lot of catch up happening, and there's a really big scramble, I think. And some of the things we're seeing in that space is people desperately trying to call their tertiary based initiatives preventative initiatives, desperately trying to shoehorn the things they're doing into a preventative model when at best they are reactive and support based.
Yeah, definitely seen plenty of that of ourselves. A lot of solutions looking for problems to fix. Rob Briner spoke really well to that, about the importance of diagnosis and actually getting solutions that deal with the problems in your organisation.
I'm a big fan of Rob. He's on my my list of people to follow, that I share with people all the time around who I think is doing great work in this space.
Yeah, for those listeners who haven't listened to the Rob Briner episode, it was a recent one. It's definitely worth a listen if you haven't already. So, Dave, what are the most important facts organisations should instead be focused on?
The important facts they should be focused on?
Yeah, instead of like some of these myths that are going around the traps.
Yeah, the workplace mental health is about fixing people. It's not about fixing people. It's about fixing work. It's around understanding that people's experience of work is a determinant of mental health outcomes, as well as performance and productivity as well. And I think that is the biggest one that people need to get their head around. It's the idea that we just need to provide more support is really flawed. We really need to be looking upstream. So the fact is, if work is designed poorly, if people's work exceeds the demands of them, exceeds their resources, their capacity to manage, if they don't have role clarity, if they're going through mismanaged organisational change, it's going to create enormous amounts of stress and strain that no resilience program or no EAP is going to be able to fix. So I think from a factual perspective, the more that organisations can actually look beyond EAP, resilience, those sorts of things, to really focus on those things that are critical around psychosocial risk design of work, that's where the people really need to be paying attention. And I think a lot of this is really perhaps changing who we're listening to and where we're getting our information from around workplace mental health, because it's been very much a provider-driven market for a very long period of time.
Yeah, and going back to the solutions and people rushing to develop solutions for this new field that they've heard of for the first time, this psychosocial risk management or psychological health and safety, there's a lot of interesting providers trying to enter the market. We saw a interesting quote on our website saying that ISO 45003 will be enforced by the regulators, even though it's a voluntary standard. And there's a really great quote on that website from Carla Caponecchia.
Yeah, Carla. Yeah.
Yeah. So unless Carla's got a sister who
also talks about cake and icing.
I think there might have been a typo. So yeah, just be wary. And if you're not sure, reach out to Dave. I've got his mobile number. I'll give it to you.
I've seen everything sold from this is the NASA-based psychodrama program that will make your staff more resilient, to gut health is the single answer that you need to actually provide for anyone who's experiencing executive stress. I've seen major organisations use sporting medical doctors to do reviews of their psychological health and safety infrastructure, with the only solution they've been put forward to is we need to promote the EAP more. So I think we've got to be really careful. Some of these things are fundamentally dangerous. They don't just take away from and remove resources from those people who might actually need it, but they can legitimately do more harm. So I think that notion of understanding how work can be a protective factor for people's mental health and well-being, understanding the psychological health benefits of work, understanding Psychosocial hazards in work is really important. Understanding the importance of things like job design, things that there's so much research literature to support those. If organisations aren't orienting towards those things and they're focusing on all the other stuff that's just really shiny, they're going to get themselves into strife.
Yeah, wise words, and so articulate again, Dave. I reckon we could easily do the 100th episode just with you. But
how to win friends and influence people, not by me. That's how to paint a massive target on your back. This is the joys of being 50 years old and at the twilight of one's career, is you get to speak independently across the industry in ways that perhaps other people aren't necessarily happy to speak up with.
Well, mate, we really value you. We value the time that you've given us today again. We know you're a very busy man, so thank you very much for joining us for our 100th, and we'll hopefully have you on a panel or something in the next year.
No worries at all. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Dave.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So it's a pleasure to introduce our next special guest all the way from Canada. So we have Mary Ann Baynton joining us today. So Mary Ann first appeared in episode 10, The Canadian Evolution, which aired on February the 22nd last year. So Mary Ann does a lot of work in the psych health and safety field, and she's also the host of our sister podcast, Psych Health and Safety in Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Mary Ann.
Thanks a lot, Alicia. So am I like a recurring character in your story?
A much loved recurring character.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Only the characters that we love to have on the podcast, Mary Ann.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Thanks.
So, I've heard some Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast episodes. How are you finding hosting the podcast over in Canada?
It's like hanging out with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even the people, because there's been several people on the podcast who I had never met before, but just fascinating to hear their stories, because psych health and safety really is the way we treat each other at work. That's all it is. But you can look at it from so many different angles, and every workplace is a little different. And so each workplace needs a different way to approach it. So I've been loving learning from people and being inspired by people and forming relationships and starting new projects. It's been a great experience.
Yeah. So lots of learning and networking and just, getting psych health and safety out there in Canada, and understanding, different contextual factors in different organizations and what their needs are. Awesome. So if you haven't joined or followed that podcast, listeners, get onto it, Psych Health and Safety in Canada. So I'm going to ask you, Mary Ann, so Canada is seen as a world leader in psychological health and safety. I think that phrase or that terminology was coined in Canada. So it was largely as a result of the work yourself and your colleagues have done in developing the national standard of Canada in psych health and safety at work. How have you seen the standard being adopted since its release in Canada and both internationally?
Mm-hmm. So next year, it'll be 10 years since it was released. Mm-hmm. There's been over 50,000 downloads of the standard by different governments, healthcare sector, education, and other types of businesses all around the world. So it's really been taken up by people who honestly have been doing this stuff for decades, but they didn't call it psych health and safety. They called it respect in the workplace. They called it performance, engagement. They called it recruitment and retention. They called it inclusion or diversity. They called it team building, but it's all the same thing, right? As I said before, it's how we interact with each other, how we treat each other in the workplace, but getting it sort of crystallized as psychological health and safety, understanding the process to think about the impact that we have on each other, I think is what the standard did. And, it's funny that you say Canada's a leader. because we were very much inspired by what Australia did and what the UK did. And so it's wonderful for me that we have been able to really connect around the globe with folks like yourself, because I think together we're raising the bar for everybody.
That's a good point. So I think when Psych Health and Safety, it's the terminology that really came, was about 10 years ago, and it's more been globally adopted since then. So we thank you for your contributions. And it's a united front, isn't it? We're all trying to achieve the same thing, and really just create awareness and educate on what is, what does that mean and what is best practice in this space. So you mentioned it is your 10th birthday next year since the standard was born. So what do you see as challenges regarding the standard in terms of how it's adopted and rolled out? So I know you've said, lots of people know about it now and it's been downloaded. What are some challenges in maybe implementing?
I think some of the challenges are people thinking you need to take on the standard and do all of it. And it's overwhelming, and there's so many other priorities in workplaces, and people get stuck. And the thing that we've been trying to say is, if you just simply ask the question, how will this policy, this program, this initiative, this change, this meeting, this interaction, this team approach, how will these potentially impact the psychological health and safety of our employees? You can begin the journey to psychological health and safety and then refer to the standard when you feel like, okay, what should we do next? Rather than see, I have to complete the standard. And I look at it the way that we look at occupational health and safety. Nobody talks about the ROI of occupational health and safety. It's risk management. We're going to do it to protect our employees. And nobody talks about when we've implemented occupational health and safety, because it's continual improvement, where it's an ongoing journey to look at where we're at today, what risks might exist, and how we might mitigate those risks. So part of the challenge, I think, is redirecting people that it doesn't have to be so hard, that it doesn't have to be so big, but we can start right now by changing the way we think and changing the way we behave. And it's as simple as that, and yet it's never going to be done and over.
Yeah, they're good points. When you think about an organization and there's different functional teams, say in HR, and they're doing things like you mentioned, respect in the workplace and diversity and inclusion, and they're all doing their own, I suppose, initiatives or work in those spaces. Psych health and safety is really about bringing those together and understanding it from a safety lens. Are there any issues or risks, within those factors? And then what can we do collectively, collaboratively to mitigate those risks? Yeah,
exactly.
Amazing. So is there anything like a what's next in terms of the standard, seeing as though a milestone decade's passing?
So the standard process here through the Canadian Standards Association is a consensus-based process where no one interest group, so not employers, not employees, not unions, not clinicians, not health and safety specialists, no one interest group can dominate. And we have to come to the table and agree. And the standard committee has been reconstituted, and there are some amazing people that are on it now, people with very diverse experiences and very diverse knowledge that have come to the table. And whereas some groups may go, they all have different perspectives, our feeling is this is great. We all have different perspectives. So together we can do our best job. So some of the things that we're looking at is we feel that inclusion is part of every psychosocial factor. It should be. And so we're thinking about, do we need to add something more specific about inclusion? We've been talking about trauma in the workplace, whether it's vicarious trauma or traumatic incidents that employees are involved in. And have we covered that well enough? So we're also looking at, how can we respect and protect the work that's been done in the last decade? So we don't want to completely start all over where the people who have invested their time and effort go, oh no, but on the other hand, can we make it both more comprehensive and easier to use? So that's really our goal. It's a big task, but over the next probably 18 months or so, we've got some very competent and eager people who are ready to take that on. And hopefully before the end of 2023, we can release a new and improved standard.
Amazing. So yeah, those factors that you mentioned, inclusion and trauma or exposure to trauma in the workplace. I guess, your current model is that 13-factor model, but it doesn't stop there. You've got the 14th. The 14th factor is kind of other factors that are, specific to organizational contexts that won't necessarily apply to all organizations. But what we're seeing more and more is, those factors that you mentioned apply to a lot of organizations. So how can you, demonstrate what needs to happen in those areas? So maybe there'll be a 14th and a 15th.
Well, Alicia, I think it's so important what you brought forward is that the factor other issues as identified by the employees is critical. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people miss that one, but it is the one that helps. And, the other thing that we're looking at is how can we align. So it's Z1003 is the standard. How can we align it so that folks who are using the ISO 45003, if they use the Canadian standard, they will still be able to say they have complied with and aligned with ISO 45003 without having to do double work.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's exciting, a little daunting, but I'm looking forward to what we can do.
And so am I, and I'm sure the team is as well. Just in this, united front in moving forward and how we can just address psych health and safety, like you say, in the most comprehensive but simplest way at the same time. It sounds all complicated, but when you think about it and what it all means, it doesn't have to be so complicated.
No, there's many approaches that are 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes once a week that actually change the behaviors of leaders, of employees, of joint health and safety committees, of wellness committees, that actually make the biggest difference rather than big programs that are paper exercises for employers.
Yeah, it is. It's incorporating it into business as usual, isn't it? Rather than having one-off activities. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Erin. I'll let you go because I know it's nighttime there in Canada and you're probably hungry and need your dinner or the time. I'm not sure exactly what the time is there. Thank you again for coming on and we will speak to you again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me. Take care.
It's always great to hear from our past guests. So a very big thank you to Beck, Wade, Peter, Hayley, Dave, and Mary Ann for joining us on this very special episode. So Joelle, thinking back over our past 100 episodes, what have you enjoyed about doing the podcasts?
I think for me, it's been an opportunity to have some very unique conversations with some really interesting people and people with so much knowledge and experience to share. And I think, having the types of conversations and getting the types of insights that you really wouldn't get at like a conference event or even just a workshop or a networking event or something like that. So I think, with a podcast format, there's sort of a level of intimacy in the conversation that you really don't get through other types of forums. So that's been great. The thing that I've enjoyed the most, just getting to know so many different fantastic people.
Yeah, cool.
What about you, Alicia?
Similar to you, Joelle, it's actually a really good opportunity. It's not just, the goal of it is to create awareness of psych health and safety for everyone, and what's best practice or what's required in the space, or what the challenges are. But it's really about even us just continuously learning from different experts in the field, from people working in particular industries, just learning from each other and growing the knowledge base, I suppose, in a format that's informal. Like you're saying, we do have more of a chat, don't we? It's not formal, and we can really get down into the nitty-gritties of it all.
And Jason, what about you?
And Jason.
Yeah, I think our listeners can probably tell, to work at People Diagnostics, you have to have a love of learning. I think we're all interested in learning and being at the top of our games and crafts. And that's definitely, been probably the biggest thing, right? Being able to speak to so many people and have unrestricted access, being able to ask the questions that we want, not just passively taking in a presentation or a webinar. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners are very jealous of us, being able to do that with the amazing guests. But more so than that, just even the ability for us to form relationships with our guests. If you think back to Mary Ann, we met her on episode 10 of the podcast. That was the first time we ever met her. And now we have such a great relationship with Mary Ann. In fact, so strong that she's now hosting our sister podcast in Canada. And I've still never met her in person. It all started from the podcast, and we've got some great friends that we've developed, by initially just having them on the podcast to start with. So I've loved that networking and relationship building, even, as much as the learning from amazing people.
Yeah.
So let's think then ahead to our next 100 episodes, because we're going to get there pretty quickly, right?
Absolutely.
It only took
maybe not as quickly as last time, because I don't think we're going to go back to doing recording 3 episodes a week.
No, particularly now that we've got the Canada and the USA podcast starting up shortly as well. Yep. We probably won't need to do 3 podcasts ourselves a week.
No, people might struggle to keep up.
Yeah, that's right. We're very keen to get content out there to begin with, but once a week is a good cadence, I think, for our listeners and our own sanity.
Yes.
So I think we'll keep it at that.
And Jack.
And Jack. Poor Jack. So Joelle, what do we have planned for our next 100 then?
Yeah, so I think lots more episodes focused on case studies of how people have actually implemented psych health and safety in their organizations, and sort of across different industries as well. So I think one of our focuses is really going to be getting a lot more practical this year, where and when we can. And obviously, as guests come along who have something interesting to say, we're always going to be happy to have them on as well. But I think, a much bigger focus on practical implementation.
Yeah, because that's the thing, right? We've had some amazing guests who come up from either deep subject matter expertise or academia, but not enough really good practical examples. And people ask us all the time, right? Like, can you tell us a company that's doing this really well? And I can't think of anyone off the top of my head that's actually nailed it. So we're and you can let our listeners in on what we've been working on to help fast track that as well. But that's something that's missing, and hopefully we can address that.
Yeah. So with our Catalyst program that we'll be kicking off within the next month, what we'll be doing is taking 10 Australian organisations, and they're sort of across 10 different industries as well. We'll actually be taking them through a full psych health and safety implementation process. So looking at actually developing their psych health and safety management system, right through to doing a first cycle of hazard identification, risk assessment and action planning. So really getting into the practical nitty gritty of how do we actually do this within an organisation, helping them through that process, giving them opportunities to share with each other as a cohort group, so sort of as a group of peers. And so as that program progresses, we'll hope to bring on some guests who are going through that process to actually share their learnings with our listeners as well.
Yeah, look, I've been really amazed at the interest in that Psych Health and Safety Catalyst program. we kind of pulled it together really quickly, thinking, hey, this is a gap and this is a way that maybe we can address it. So to have 10 really great companies as well wanting to participate is fantastic. And we're already getting a wait list for early 2023 Catalyst program as well.
And even mid 2023.
Yes, people are now booking on for the end of 2023. Yeah.
Yep.
So actually on that, listeners, we have done the current Catalyst program invite only through our own connections. If you are interested and you're in a large company, so 5,000 employees or more, you feel free to reach out to Joelle or myself if you want more interest on that. But we'll be bringing you lots of updates over the coming months as we go through that Catalyst program and get some of the participants on the podcast to talk about it.
Yeah, it'll be a learning experience for all of us.
Yeah, and that's what the podcast is all about, right?
Yep.
Sharing those learnings.
Absolutely. So Alicia, one of the common themes that have come up during many of our episodes and something that we plan to address with our Catalyst program is the need for upskilling and collaboration across the different functional teams within an organization. So how can organizations best approach this, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about psychological health and safety or workplace mental health. I know those two terms are interchangeable still. To think about it as, to do this effectively, you need to take a systemic approach. You need to think of the function as a system. And like you've already mentioned, it's a psychological health and safety system and how to implement that system. So if we think about it from a systems perspective, it's, thinking about which teams in your organization, so which of those functional teams, whether they sit in health and safety, in HR, in injury management, it'll all depend on how your organization is structured. But all of those functional teams have a role to play. And even down to, line managers and leaders and how they're understanding what this function is and what this system is, and how to maintain it as, an ongoing system. So what we need to be thinking about is, firstly, identifying your functional teams in your organizations. So health and safety, HR might have organizational development, leadership and culture, all of those different teams, injury management, return to work. You need to be ensuring that all of those different teams understand what psychological health and safety is. So providing specific training for those teams, just so everyone is talking the same language and having a unified approach or a streamlined approach. And each of those teams will, like I said, have a role to play. And it's really making sure that your, those teams need to understand what role it is that they play. So moving on to role clarity, making sure that, you understand if you're in health and safety, what your responsibilities are to maintain the psychological health and safety system, for example. But then if you're in HR, it might be that your responsibilities will lie within making sure all of these different functional teams are keeping up with their competencies for understanding what they need to do. And then even at that action planning phase, once you know what your hazards are from a psychosocial perspective, if you've assessed the risk and you've identified what the risks are, you will need to then respond to those risks according to your data and your information. So that will require action planning. So you might have an action plan for the organization, you might have action plans for specific areas in the organization, and it might be HR's responsibility then to partner with different areas or departments to come up with those actions. So it's really about training and upskilling your functional teams and making sure that they understand what role they play in managing and maintaining this system. And also down to the level of the line managers, making sure that, informing all of your line managers that they have a responsibility too. What is that responsibility when it comes to workplace mental health? So, as basic as it gets is they need to be understanding, what psychosocial hazards are and what role they play in identifying them, over time, and then how to actually mitigate any risks if they're there. And checking in with staff and making sure that that consultation is ongoing with staff around how they're finding work, their roles, the system that they work in. And by doing that and checking in and having those conversations, they're actually monitoring risks as weeks and months pass forward. So not just waiting for a formal risk assessment, but they do have a role to play also in ongoing management.
Yeah. And if we're thinking about making cultural change and elevating, I guess, psychological health and safety, then line managers, I think, are the face of that for the organization, for the average employee. And so for them to be able to talk about work design and aspects of good work that facilitate good mental wellbeing and be confident and competent in that area, then I think that's going to have a big impact on the overall culture.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think, it's that ensuring leadership capability is there. And HR probably has a big role to play in that, continuously making sure, as leaders come and go as well or change roles, that they're aware of, what role they play in creating a psychologically healthy and safe work environment. What does that mean and what do they need to look out for and do?
Yeah.
So another topic that we've often spoken about on the podcast is psychosocial risk assessment and how most of the tools available at the moment on the market, they don't actually give an indication of risk. What do you see as the main opportunities for innovation in this area?
Yeah, so regular listeners would have heard my take on psychosocial risk assessment a few times, but I guess for new listeners or for people who haven't listened to those episodes, we see that, I guess, current methodology around psychosocial risk assessment is really limited. Typically, you don't get an outcome that you'd expect from a health and safety risk assessment, which is likelihood and consequence of harm. And so you could argue, well, if you're not getting likelihood and consequence of harm as an output, then really what you've performed isn't actually a risk assessment. So we really feel that there's a big need for innovation in this area. And particularly when you look at things like the incoming, well, now they're actually out, the model,
Published,
the model workplace health and safety updates which incorporate psych health and safety. But they have flagged that for a company to assess the risk, they need to understand the severity and frequency and duration of psychosocial hazard exposure. So if you look at an employee engagement survey or an employee perception style survey, where you're just asking people a few questions around different domains like workload or autonomy or supervisor support, and you're just asking them to agree to strongly disagree on a number of statements, it's highly unlikely you're considering the severity, frequency, and duration of exposure. You're just getting perceptions of work design, which is fundamentally different from a risk assessment. So, we're really excited that we actually have a risk assessment that we've designed ourselves, and we believe it's the first in the world to actually take this methodology, which is more akin to an occupational hygiene exposure assessment, which asks people to reflect on the severity, frequency, and duration of stress experienced in response to different psychosocial hazards. The other thing that we're working towards using longitudinal data, and the Catalyst program is going to be fantastic for this because we're going to have upwards of 10,000 people participating in it to give us a really large data source, is asking people 3 or 6 months following a risk assessment about their experience of burnout, psychological distress, absenteeism, and presenteeism in order to come up with a predictive rating of risk. So really, what we're working towards is not just looking at each hazard in isolation, which is a limitation of current methodology, but also moving towards, hey, what is your cumulative psychological injury risk based on all of these factors that you've assessed? And really the end point is we want to get to a point where following a survey immediately, once you've closed it off, you could see, well, our overall risk score is say 80 out of 100. Now, what does that mean? Well, we can say, well, companies that score 80, for instance, maybe it's, hey, if you don't do anything in the next 6 months, you can expect 30% of your employees to experience burnout, 20% of employees to take time off work due to work-related stress, maybe 1% will actually lodge a formal psychological injury claim. And in that way, that's something that you could elevate to exec or board level very easily, going, well, we did our risk assessment. This is the likelihood and consequence of harm. And then it's up for the exec and board to determine, hey, are we comfortable with that? They can actually accept that risk if they want, or they can say, no, you know what? We don't actually like that negative impact that we're having on our employees. And, you know, really our target should be here. And how do we get there? Well, we look back at our risk assessment results and we can see the hazards that have most contributed to the overall risk score. And then that is obviously where we can prioritize action. So, you know, what we're doing, you know, I'm really excited. You know, we love innovating here. And I think that's a really much needed innovation, actually really having an assessment that can be scaled effectively to help companies understand risk in a way that they are used to understanding risk, so likelihood and consequence of harm, and having that predictive algorithm in there as well is going to be really exciting over the coming months.
Yeah, and I'm quite excited just from that perspective. I mean, outside of our own interests in terms of what that can actually add to the general body of research around psychosocial hazards and the connections with health outcomes. I think to actually have some really strong data in there will be fantastic for the broader community. Yeah,
so I like this idea of not just attaching an ROI figure to it, but looking at actually health implications. The ROI argument and, you know, what companies can expect dollar for dollar in investment in mental health in the workplace, I don't think it's really moved the needle at all. I don't think the board's really necessarily interested in it, but understanding the health impacts for broader sustainability and corporate social responsibility, I think is important.
Yeah, and then that, you know, that does go out into then more social impacts outside of just your bottom line in terms of your employees, but also, yeah, what are you contributing to the disease burden within your community?
Yeah, and that could be the supply chain, it could be families and that as well. So really interested about the future of that and you know, what part we can play, not just in terms of educating people through our 45,003 Training Academy and through this podcast, but also, you know, in terms of making some of these tools available worldwide.
Yeah, just imagine what things we'll be able to talk about at episode 200.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to be slowing down the pace of the release of these episodes. Yeah. So yeah, you'd think a lot would have changed by then.
Yeah, we should have at least 2 cohorts done by then. So
and hopefully our first cohorts in UK and Canada as well. So no, it's going to be. I'm going to have to listen back to this episode 100. Well, I think all of us have really enjoyed the first 100 episodes and definitely looking forward to the next 100. We're planning on sticking around and continuing to push out these podcasts, and we'll be aiming for that weekly cadence. So, now on behalf of myself, Joelle, Alicia, it's been great doing these podcasts with you, and look forward to continuing to do them.
Here.
Likewise.
All right. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of a very long but very special 100th episode of the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. Thank you so much to our regular listeners in particular who've been with us on this journey ever since episode 1. And to our new listeners, we hope that you'll continue to tune in and take in some of the great content from the amazing guests that we somehow managed to get on our podcast. Remember that we do video these things. So in fact, we've been videoing this whole 100th episode, even though we've recorded it over several episodes. Thanks to Jack for putting it together, and a big shout out to Jack as well.
Yeah, big shout out to Jack.
Our master editor.
All the post-production work and all the social media clips, that's all Jack. So thanks to Jack. You can check out the videos that Jack has stitched together on the Flourish DX YouTube page.
And he does pop the odd Easter egg in there. So
he does. It's very rare, but he does. Yeah. I love him to take small liberties on that. I love a good Easter egg.
You hear that, Jack? You've got permission.
There you go. If you go over to the Flourish DX LinkedIn page, you'll see some clips from this episode as well with our amazing guests. While you're over on LinkedIn, then feel free to connect with Alicia, myself, and Joelle if you'd like to continue the conversation. But that brings us to the end of episode 100, and we'll catch you in episode 101.
Hooray.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.